Hello! I'm really excited for today's chat. I hope you are well. I'm just going to hang on for a second here while Lauren comes on. Today, it's Mom Bod Mondays. Yeah! I'm actually really looking forward to today's interview. I have been following Lauren for a long time. Hello. And you originally met Lauren kind of in her capacity as a fitness professional. Right now, Lauren is pursuing her education to become a sex therapist, actually. And so a lot of the stuff that Lauren shares on her own profile, if you found her maybe through my stories earlier, is around body image, sexual shame, and parenting our kids around sex as well. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation. There she is. And if you know me, you know I always like to see how it interplays with how we care for our bodies. So I'm going to talk to Lauren about as it pertains to kind of motherhood and the changes in our bodies and our perceived roles. Here she comes. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
It's so nice to talk to you. I think we've been following each other for years.
Yes, yes, yes. I was just telling my husband that. He's like, how do you know this person? And I said, I have actually been following her for a very long time.
A long time. And I was trying
Yeah.
to remember what the original connection was, and I feel like it came through like a Girls Gone Strong, like Jessie Mandel, maybe back when she was doing some of their parenting related stuff. I couldn't remember. It's a long time ago.
I think it was definitely my goal because it was probably right after I took her course on just perinatal fitness. So, yeah.
That must be it. I must have found her through you. So it's so nice to talk to you, and I love these. I love connecting with people that I have sort of stalked from afar for years. So for those who don't know, who are maybe coming from my following, Lauren, can you just tell us about yourself? How old are your kiddos? Where are you? What do you do really quickly in a nutshell?
Sure. So, really quickly, so I'm a mom of four. I have a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And I've been a nurse for the last 10 years, really got into fitness more, I'll keep this short, but probably more from, well, a lifelong athlete. And then it
Yeah.
kind of developed into more disordered habits. So I got really interested around that. And then just through being postpartum 4 different times, I really found that at the time that was a very underserved population. And so I wanted to emphasize more in that. And I just kind of started evolving and realizing the sexual health component of it and how little we talk about that with women. And so I just kind of took it one step further and decided to go back to school. So now I'm in grad school and I'm getting my master's in social work, and my goal is to become a sex therapist. So I'm also working on my certification towards sex therapy. So
That's amazing. So that's a separate, like a completely separate certification or like a specialization, I guess?
it is. So the governing body of that is called ASECT, and what that just means is I'm with a certified sex therapist. I do extra hours. I do just extra support, extra education to become a sex therapist specifically. So, yeah.
Okay. Now, I think when we hear the term sex therapist,
Mhm.
it can be a little bit hard to understand what that relationship looks like. So, someone coming to your practice as a sex therapist, when you establish your practice finally, what sort of a service is that, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term?
People, I'm like, okay, this is not weird. Let's talk about what this means.
I'm sure,
So,
as with anything, it doesn't dive right into, you know what I mean? You build up.
yeah, exactly. So for me, what I have found, my practicum this last year has had a few sex therapy clients, and what this means for a lot of people that I work with is I'm working with people that experience low desire, that experience trouble with arousal, that experience sexual orientation issues, gender orientation issues, people that have a history of sexual trauma, sexual abuse. And so those are, and I will say too, I don't know if this is kind of just specifically where I'm from or if this is probably a general something that people struggle with, but is sexual shame. And that is
Yeah.
something, that's an underlying component to a lot of the folks that I work with is just working through sexual shame. So it's
I
a
feel
good
like this
one.
must be a really interesting time to work in that profession because the fact that so many of these issues are being brought to light in a more public sphere, I guess must be helping people to kind of unearth stuff that might have been repressed or ignored in the
Absolutely.
times when it wasn't okay to say it out loud, you know?
Yes. And I think just normalizing the conversation around sexuality, whatever that might be,
Mm-hmm.
that whatever it is that you're experiencing, it's probably very, very normal. It's just that we haven't had a space to talk about that. So, yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
normalizing a lot of
So
experiences for people.
I think so, and making us all realize how many experiences exist on a spectrum and are not binary or dichotomous, right? So that's a really interesting way to reframe the whole world. Um,
Yeah.
so before we get into the meat of it, because I sent you some questions about specifically, I think these issues are really interesting for my audience around motherhood and the changes in the body, changes in also the way that we're perceived as instruments of society as we go through the process of pregnancy, birth, and then motherhood and get into like where you and I are the old mom stage, you know? I think a lot of my followers do have older kids. There are some with little kids and lots with older kids. So, but tell us, because you have a free Facebook group. So for anyone who doesn't hang on for the entire chat, can you tell us just quickly what your Facebook group is oriented around and if they can find it in your profile maybe?
Yeah, yeah. I will say too, I am working on being better about posting in there. Balancing kind of mom life with
Yeah.
school and all the things has been a challenge. So I hope to continue to post in there more, but it's a broad spectrum of things that we discuss. Anywhere from, I have found that most people are like, how do I teach sex education to my own
Mm-hmm.
children? But I think a
Yep.
big problem with that is too, and I say this from my own experience, is at one point I didn't know what all sex education meant. So that's something that we talk about a lot is just consent, autonomy, how to make those healthy choices that feel right for you, because that for most of us that's something that we weren't ever
Mm-hmm.
taught. And so
Mm-hmm.
now we're trying to teach our children and we want to do better, we just don't know exactly how to do better. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, really cool. So
the
is there a link
Facebook
in your
group.
bio, Lauren, if they go to your link in bio?
Yes, I believe so. And I'll add that after we hop off here just to be
Okay.
sure. Yeah.
Or we could, yeah. That would be the next level with Instagram is if they would finally let us share live links, in
Yeah.
comments and stuff. But link in bio,
Yeah.
go see Lauren there. And I know her to be a very supportive and practical resource. So I'm sure that you can find support within her community there as well. So let's get right to some questions. Are you ready?
Sure, I'm ready. Yeah,
Okay.
these made me think pretty hard, I won't lie.
I am very cerebral.
Yeah.
So, um, to the point of a fault. Okay, so the first question I have about you is about all of this. To try to unpack this a little bit, is kind of around body image and sexual shame, and how is our body image maybe informed by sexual shame, and specifically, I guess, in the context of women going into motherhood or their child-rearing years or beyond, basically.
So it's really interesting, and I've been fascinated from like a clinician and also a mother standpoint to watch my own daughter. She's 7 years old, and to watch just how early that body image really takes shape and takes
Mm-hmm.
hold, and what they notice, even when you feel like you're doing all the things to protect them and create diversity and inclusion in their life. You see the struggles that they still experience very, very early on. So for me, with all of my children and myself, it's been a matter of normalizing diversity and really talking about just the different experiences they have and being that one person that they can come to and talk about those issues with, because I feel like for myself and my transition into motherhood, that was something that I didn't have. And
Mm-hmm.
so my measure of these, cultural standards was media, movies,
Mm-hmm.
people that curated these beautiful social media feeds and made me feel like, oh gosh, that's what I should be striving to be. Where
Totally.
in reality, we know that's not true, but it's still really hard to fight back against when those are the messages that we see just over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for a lot of people, and specifically mothers, we have these standards that we hold ourselves to. And a lot of those, so in social work, we learned that we kind of view this from like a micro, meso, and macro level. So we know that we have these like micro influences, which is our family, it's our thoughts, our attitudes, our beliefs. And then we have these like mid-level experiences where it's like our community, maybe our religion. And then we have these broader social structures that kind of guide us on how we should be. And that sexual shame really takes root when we have curiosities, we have desires, we have fantasies, we have questions, and we don't have anybody to turn to talk to about those things. And so we harbor those and we don't talk about them, and we think there's something wrong with us. And so I think it goes back to your point about how we're changing the narrative and the discussion around sexuality, and we're making it more accessible for people, but we're still working through a lot of these issues.
So when we're talking about sort of these, as you said, these different levels of influence on our self-image, really, because I suppose it doesn't just come down to the part of it. I think is probably appearance-based messaging. I would assume around sort of what our bodies are supposed to look like and what is an appropriate sexual body. And I can imagine some of those influences are probably mainstream media, but also pornography and those kinds of things.
Yeah. And the pornography one is really interesting and something that I'm going to talk about really soon in my Facebook group, because we know through research that kids are exposed to pornography very early on. Yeah. And so it's really, really important to, not get mad at them and talk to them about it because they're curious. And a lot of kids are not receiving the sex education that they need. And so, can you hear me?
Sorry, someone is like spam texting and trying to WhatsApp message me like a creepy man. Apologies. If it goes like if it does that again, it's probably someone trying to call me. Ignore it.
Because I'm like, I don't know. It's probably me. Okay. So what I was saying was, and I've done a lot of research around this in grad school, is just our lack of sex education.
Yeah.
And
like lack of detail, right? Or treating it only it's a very medical kind of cold process.
It's very shame-based. For most people, it's abstinence only. And so we don't leave room for the experiences, this broad range of experiences that people have around sexuality. And so we turn to things like pornography because we're curious. And then that turns into other things. So that's that's something that, I'm dealing with myself right now. I have a 15-year-old boy and a 13-year-old boy. And so we're constantly having these conversations of like, okay, what have you seen? Let's talk about it. What are we going to do to make this different? What are we going to, and part of that includes outlining values that your family has around sexuality. So what does this mean to us? How do we handle this? What are our expectations? So
can I ask you a quick question? I feel like I could talk to you about this until like the end of the day, but I'm going to just interject here and there, just asking questions as someone who doesn't study this for a living. So your kids are 13 and 15. Your eldest kids are 13 and 15. My eldest is about to turn 14. I have one son only. He's 11 and a half. I don't shy away from these topics, but I don't necessarily initiate them. I wait until they ask me questions, or if something comes up, I say, do you have any questions? Do you think it's important to sit down and say, okay, like, tell me what you know. Tell me what you know, or tell me what you think you know. Or do you wait for them to come to you with questions and go at their pace?
Okay.
Did that come through?
The very last part of.
No worries.
Yeah, a lot of that cut out. But what I heard was you asking, do you wait to come to them? Do you wait for them to come to you, or do you come to them?
Exactly.
Yeah, I would say that I go to my boys because, and this is true for any child. We don't have to just say boys or girls, any child, right? So I go to them because I want them to know that, hey, I'm not uncomfortable. Let's talk about everything. There is nothing you can hit me with. I might not always have the answer, but I will help you find the answer, and we will navigate this together. Because I want to be that person for them. I want to be the sex expert in our home.
Yes, so I love that, Lauren. So good.
Yes, yeah, so that they know that they can come to me about any question that they have, and that I'm not going to shame them I mean, I'm not going to lie, I might not always love their choices, but
Mm-hmm.
we'll work through that. We'll talk about that. So
Mm-hmm. So
I
you
go
can
to them.
have, you're also establishing that you can have difference. You can have, you can have a difference of opinion or a difference of desire, whatever, you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be your way or the highway. You're just opening the conversation up, right?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, and we talk about that related to like all sorts of issues. I mean, religion. We try to talk about everything. So
Mm-hmm. I love
at
that.
an appropriate a level.
Right,
So
right. So when
yeah.
they're little kids, I think for the parents who maybe have little kids, at that stage, are you waiting for them to come to you with questions, though? Is there a stage, would you say there's a certain age where we should probably assume they're encountering it, or that the research says they're probably encountering it outside of the house, if not at home, without you being aware?
It's probably earlier than you think. It's usually around 11, 12,
Okay,
13, you know, and I think technology has changed so much of that, and that's why you have
totally.
to get out ahead of it because they're
Yeah.
looking for it. They're looking it up. They've got friends. Their friends have older siblings, you know, so
Mm-hmm.
they'll find it.
Okay.
If they have questions, they'll find it.
It's true. And it's as with anything, it's in your parenting, it's like, do you want to do it reactively or proactively? I mean, I'm
Don't lie.
great at
Sometimes I'm
reacting.
very reactive. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. I can react with the best of them. So if we
Oh,
come
yeah.
back to this sort of like sexual shame, and we are kind of discussing how it starts to embed itself in childhood with these different influences. And you mentioned that a lot of us have had parenting influences from our own families of origin that have encouraged this kind of shame, or maybe like were the source of it, I suppose. Are there just a few kind of core messages that you think a lot of the people who come to you have received that maybe, I don't know if that's an appropriate question, but you mentioned abstinence until marriage, some that maybe are common themes when someone is dealing with sexual shame.
Yeah, I would say for myself, and I mean, all of this within the context of like, I'm a really big newbie here. So, you
Yeah.
know, within the therapy world. But a lot for me, I have realized is around sexual minorities where they can't find access to other people that have the same experiences to them. And
Mm-hmm.
then also people that just have shame around religious expectations.
Right.
And it's important to distinguish between shame and guilt. So a lot of times for religious expectations, it's around a guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes as parents, I think we can guilt our kids into doing or behaving or being certain ways that are our expectations. But really so much of that is rooted in fear. We don't want our
Mm-hmm.
children to, you know, have things that happen to them before they're ready.
Yeah.
And so that's the approach that we know how to take. And so really working through a lot of that messaging around
Mm-hmm.
just, you know, you get to develop your own sexual script as an adult. You were taught
Mm-hmm.
this as a child, but now as an adult, what do you believe? What are your values? What's important to you? So it's kind of redefining all that as an adult compared to what we were taught as a child.
Mm-hmm. So particularly as we move into motherhood, pregnancy and motherhood,
Mm-hmm.
what kinds of themes or commonalities have you learned about mothers experiencing in terms of body image and sexual shame?
Yeah, so I think it's important for mothers to just understand that they're not alone in their experience of, you know, low desire, low arousal. And those things aren't like clinically, they don't have to be considered a sexual dysfunction,
Yeah.
which I think there's a label on that a lot. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
important to understand that there is just times in your life where those things will ebb and flow. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes your desire is going to be higher, sometimes it's going to be lower. And then working through those feelings of negative body image, that's really
Mm-hmm.
hard. And I think just making sure you have very open communication with your partner about what you're experiencing is key, because when we suffer in those things alone and in silence, that's when they feel really big and insurmountable. So I think it's really important to just have that ongoing dialogue with your partner about what you're going through. And I think it also can relate to pain with sex. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something, you know, that we're starting to talk about a lot more, is just knowing that that doesn't have to be the case, that, you know, pain is not, it's common, but it's not normal. So what are your resources to get that figured out? And for some people, that's rooted in other things like trauma or past trauma or even trauma with childbirth. So it's so multifaceted. It's just we are such complex people. We bring so many issues. So that's why therapy can be so good to like sift out all of the issues that we bring with our humanness. So
Absolutely. And one of the things I keep hearing from you, probably because it's something I'm tuned to, but what I keep hearing from you is about how, separating our reality and what's normal or natural from the expectations that maybe have been put upon us, either coming back to those three levels you mentioned, by family messaging around what a wife's or mother's role is, or what it is to be a sexual woman or not.
Yeah.
And then cultural and kind of gender and societal constructs. And I, it's funny because I'll use myself for an example, but I wasn't raised in a family where sex was described as shameful. It certainly wasn't. It was the 80s. It wasn't we weren't super open about it, but I got the talk at home. I was never, it was very clear I could have whatever sexual orientation was natural to me, and that would be fine, and et cetera. So in that way, I was probably raised a bit atypically for the 80s. But we were also raised atheist. So there was no religious umbrella. However, even despite that, I have to admit that coming into motherhood, in my 20s, I think experimenting, promiscuity, everything you do, I did it all, as most of us probably do to some extent. And then as I came into motherhood, I found this new kind of prudish shame that wasn't really typical of my personality in any other way, but I just had to realize that some of that was really just messaging about like what a mother is supposed to do or want or provide.
Look like or act like, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I've always been aware that it was a sort of external stuff that I've been processing, but it's been an interesting experience, even having been raised in a fairly liberal household as a child, that those things can still be in there and they can come up latently. It's not necessarily like, you can have had many sexual experiences. And they can be so interwoven with body image stuff and relationship stuff and kind of how you see the world stuff. And part of it for me was realizing what my real views were about marriage and heterosexuality and all of that. Like, it's so much bigger than just, I don't like the way my body looks and you know what I mean, or whatever, right?
Right. And I think about that too. I became a mother very early. And so I don't think I had time to even think about those things. So it hasn't been until my late 30s that I've been like, what does all of this mean to me?
Yeah.
And my husband and I talk about that a lot. I'm like, I have changed a lot. My views have changed a lot as I discover, like, who am I? What do I believe? And so these are the things that I hope to instill in my kids. And it'll take them a while to figure out because we have to figure these things out as, we mature and as we learn. But just helping people and ourselves and kids realize you get to define that for yourself. I will give you the resources, but you get to define that for yourself.
And I think there's actually, for me, there's been a bit of a healing in having my kids come up to this age where now we sit in front of sex scenes together in a movie. I mean, that's not something that wouldn't be the reason I wouldn't put a movie on. I wouldn't put a movie on if it had blatant face-to-face violence. I wouldn't put it on if it had racism, but I'll put it on if it's sex. Right. And a little bit of that is me kind of making myself get used to the idea that this isn't, I do have some stuff to work through around this, but I don't want my children to experience those same feelings. And if those feelings exist, I want to deal with them early, not later, So there's been
important.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well,
no.
I just think it's important to acknowledge, like, these conversations probably will be kind of awkward, and that's okay. I mean, even I research this stuff and write about it all day, and still when my kids come to me, I'm kind of like, okay, let's work through this, But I mean, I think that's okay. That just shows, like, I'm human, you're human. We're going to work through this together. That's okay. And like, I go back to this all the time. I may not have the answers, but I will find it for you. I promise.
Yes. I love that. That's such a great takeaway. And then it really is, I think it does give us the opportunity to re-inform ourselves, re-educate ourselves. And to access information now in 2021, which is very different, as you already said, from what we would have been accessing in the 90s or whenever we were first looking for sex ed or receiving sex ed or whatever, right?
Or not, yeah. Or not receiving any of it.
I guess so. And apparently we did have it. It's really hard to remember back, but I feel like maybe this would be funny if we share our sex ed stories, but I think ours was around grade 5, and they divided the girls. They did a certain portion, the girls and the boys together, which is so problematic right there. But they divided the class up, and then it was then they explained, I guess, the more embarrassing parts to just the girls or just the boys. And I can't recall what was what, although I do remember that birth control, I think, was, boys don't need to know about that. So anything to do with birth control was kind of the girls' problem.
Yeah.
What about you? What was your, did you have state sex ed? You're in U.S., right? We're in Canada.
I'm in the United States. Yeah. I honestly cannot remember. I cannot remember my sex ed at all, which tells me that it was probably absolutely
not very meaningful.
No, nothing. And it's interesting because I'm a nurse too, and so I even think back to what I've been told, and it's so very little. I mean, I've really had to seek out my own education around all this. So it just makes me think where are people getting this? They're not. They don't know. They don't have this information unless they're explicitly seeking it out. So
yeah, and there have been moments where I've been surprised by how little my kids know. I've assumed they know things that they don't know, and I don't really. Our curriculum up here in Canada, or it's province by province here, as I think your education is state by state in the U.S., right? So province by province, it's changing, getting updated a little bit. And so they're starting to include more teaching children about the mechanics of what is oral sex? What is anal sex? What, you know what I mean? Those kinds of things. We certainly didn't have that. But I think also that it's being delivered and it's, as with anything, you teach it once for 1 week and think that it's getting in there. It's not getting in there.
Well, and that's too, and I talk about that a lot. Like sex ed should be tons of tiny conversations with your kid, not one big one. That term, the talk, makes me crazy because I'm it should be the talks to infinity. Okay, are we done with this? We're done with this now, right? And then you leave them. You leave them to go have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever, and let them figure the rest out. Well, one of my mentors said to me, she's we teach a kid over and over how to drive a car, and we still don't totally trust them. We should not give them one talk and just assume that we trust them. No, this is not enough. There's a middle ground where you're not getting in the bed with them. but you feel you've done all you can do. Yes. Time to take the wheel. It's time to leave the nest. Lauren, I feel like we could go on for this all day, and I didn't prep you for this. I just wondered if you have any favorite books or resources, websites, other professionals that I could maybe tag in the comments, or you could shoot off real quick. So for women's health, I would say Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. That's such a great book. Every person should read that. Come As You Are. Becoming Cliterate, that's a great one by Dr.
I've never even heard
Lori
of that one.
Yeah, Becoming Cliterate, that's a great one. I think Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex by Peggy
we can find them and tag them. They probably have Insta accounts, Okay, cool.
Books are great. And then I actually, in my, those little bubbles underneath. The
highlights, yep.
There you go, thank you.
Yep.
I've highlighted some books on consent because that's kind of my
big
focus right now is consent and pleasure and what does that mean and how do we incorporate that more? When does that start? Blah, blah, blah. So go in my highlights. I've highlighted some books in there that people can utilize for kiddos of all ages. So.
Yeah, and just before we sign off, I have to encourage everyone, if you made it to this far, and I think I hyped her up in the beginning, but I highly encourage you to follow Lauren. Lauren, respectfully and with consent, shares stories and her own learnings with her sons who are of the age to have these discussions. And I think it's rare. It's got to be rare because I do enough social media. It's rare to see a woman talk about sexual consent with her teenage sons openly and to share how that plays out. And I have found it so reassuring, comforting, and calming to follow along when you share those posts because you make it so normal and so approachable. So I highly encourage anyone who's following, go check out Lauren.
I really
Yeah.
appreciate that.
No, I appreciate what you do. Well, we could go forever. Maybe we'll just do a round 2 sometime.
I would love to.
Thank you. This is Lauren's first Instagram Live, by the way, everyone, and she crushed it. I don't know how you're not doing an Instagram Live a week, because this is such an interesting topic, and I know there's other people that want to talk to you about this. This was really helpful.
Oh, thank you. Maybe you've made this feel less scary for me, so maybe I will in the future.
You're awesome. I'm nothing if not relatable.
Thank you.
So have a great day. Hello, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for following along. Go check out Lauren, and I'll DM you, and we'll try to tag some of those accounts for the resources that Lauren mentioned that are helpful for us at home. Okay?
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for sharing. Bye.